Welcome back to Girl Gang and our study of Heart and Hustle, Portraits of Fearless Faith. I'm Brandy Cortez Hickson, and I get the pleasure of talking to you tonight about one of my favorite stories in Scripture, even though it's not one of the longest or biggest or most well-known. Tonight we're on Lesson 5, and we're talking about Shiphrah and Puah, and we'll get into who they are in just a second, but I want to kind of just take a minute and encourage you. We're at Lesson 5 of 8 lessons, and it's been an incredible study so far. I know you've probably been challenged with some of the questions we're asking and the things we're digging deep on, and it'll be about this time in any Bible study or any small group environment when you start to wonder if you can finish it. Like, there are things that happen, and we're at that point in the school year where calendars are getting really full and things are getting really busy. And I just want to encourage you to take the time to really kind of lean in these last few weeks. I understand crazy schedules. I've got 4 kids of my own. Thank God 2 of them are already out of the house. But we've got 5th grade graduations, and we have FSA testing, and we've got end of the course testing kind of happening everywhere, and it's crazy. But we have to take this time. It's good for us. It fulfills us, it encourages us, and it helps to empower us to do those tough things as they arise. And speaking of tough things, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit difficult for some people because it can be a little uncomfortable sometimes. Tonight's study of Shiphrah and Puah, we're actually going to talk about obedience. You see, they feared God more than the leaders of the day during the time they were living. Theirs was a portrait of obedience. We're going to find, as we kind of read through their story, that you're not going to hear a lot about key words like faith or bravery or boldness. We're looking literally at obedience, even when it's the scariest thing in the world to do. Now, Shiphrah and Puah were midwives way back in the day when the children of Israel were still in captivity under Pharaoh's rule in Egypt. So most of us have heard the story of Moses and how he freed the Israelites into the promised land and set them free from Pharaoh, led them out of captivity. Now, this is all happening as part of that time frame and part of that general era and story. Shiphrah and Puah were midwives, and that means that they were women who were entrusted with the care and the birth of young infants that were brought into the world. Back before hospitals and OB wards and maternity suites and Baptist South, women were having babies at home. And midwives were the overseers and the caregivers during that time frame. They were highly respected members of their community. They were trusted by leaders and by their people alike. They were also typically of the time frame women who were barren. They were not able to have children of their own. So they committed their entire lives to being available to other women, to supporting them, and to helping them have their babies and to see their dreams realized. Now, these again were women who were highly respected by their leaders. Pharaoh had instructions for the midwives of Israel. And as we get into this time, we can see just sort of a glimpse, a peek into his fear. He was terrified that this large group of people that he had enslaved and that were in captivity under his rule and working for him were soon going to outnumber him. They were having babies, and their families and their households were growing. And Pharaoh was terrified that they were going to raise up an army for these young children. So what he says to Shiphrah and Puah during this time is he orders them to be present at these deliveries, and if the child is a boy, to kill him. If it's a girl, to let her live. Now, that gives you a little bit of insight into Pharaoh's mindset. He was terrified that these babies, these little boys, would grow up to be the army that would strike out against him to set Israel free. Well, we all know that's not really how the story went, but his fear didn't prevail either way. Now, when we look at Shiphrah and Puah, we find that God had other plans. In fact, he instructed Shiphrah and Puah to let those babies live, all of them. And these midwives had a choice to make. They could adopt a fear of their leader. They could adopt the fear that even he had had. They would worry about their own lives, their own safety, or they could be obedient to God. Now, nowhere in here do we find or see in Scripture that they had great faith or that they were believing for the best or just had some amazing charismatic epiphany that they just knew everything was going to be okay. We're not told that. What we're told is that they were obedient to God anyway. So as they looked through as they went through this process and delivered these babies, what we find is that they saved every child. And when Pharaoh approaches them and says, why didn't you obey my orders and you let those babies live? Because now he doesn't want to be a murderer. He wanted the blood to be on their hands. So he says, why didn't you do what I asked you to do? And the midwives simply tell him, well, the Hebrew women were just too vigorous. They're too healthy, and they gave birth before we could even get there. So we had nothing to do with it. We couldn't even get in there on time to do what you asked. Because these Hebrew women listened to God's orders, the people continued to increase in their numbers, and God blessed them for their obedience. We're told a few verses later that he opens up their wombs. He takes these two women who acted in obedience, and he gave them the blessing that they'd always wanted. He gave them the opportunity and the gift of having families of their own. Now, I want you to really pay attention to the details as we kind of get in here. So very often we have our own plan for our lives. We believe and we listen to voices of people we believe have influence because they have a platform. And it's in politics, in our personal relationships, even in our own minds. But God has clear instructions for the life that we are called to lead. And we're called first to listen and then obey. Now, it is really, really popular right now to get wrapped up in this idea that if we just step out in faith and romance and intimacy, and we've talked about all those things, and they're all great by themselves, but there will be moments, lovely, when God will ask you to do something and you can't feel your way behind it. You can't quite drum up the emotional charge or the intimacy or the understanding or the love or the, conviction to get there. And we're told to be obedient anyway, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's scary, even when we have those moments where we don't feel it, we are called to do it. We are called to listen to him and to obey. And in the last few weeks, we have talked a lot about hearing God's voice. We talked about intimacy in our last session and how to really spend time with God so you recognize his voice. Well, Shiphrah and Puah knew God's voice and they decided to obey it. It was a decision. What if they hadn't? What if they had leaned into their fear and given into their earthly leaders' demands? What if they had killed those children? What if they did not ever get to a point where the Hebrews were never delivered from Egypt? We serve a God that has a clear and precise and very unique plan for our lives. We have to be willing, however, to walk in that plan in order to see it fulfilled. We have to know how to obey his voice over all other voices, even when other voices, those worldly voices, are the loudest ones. It can be really hard to stand against what everybody else is saying, to go against the flow, to be not popular, to not have the same sound and the same look and the same tone to our actions and our words and our feelings as the rest of the world, even within the realms of the church. But we're called to trust God and his voice above all others, so that when we hear that voice clearly and others start to fade away, we can verify by looking at his word and reading our Bible and coming to understand his heart. We find his instructions become clearer and clearer in our own life. When Shiphrah and Puah chose to obey God's instructions to save his people, he rewarded them with what they thought was impossible, children of their own. Where they once could only bring life from others, they now were able to create that life within themselves. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Those plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Those are verses from the Bible that tell us that just like God rewarded them, he wants to reward us. He doesn't want to draw life from the rest of the world. He wants to breathe his life into us. They're not our source. If we're looking to be filled up and inspired and encouraged to move on, empowered or emotionally charged to move forward, we're always going to find that we will never end up where we were supposed to be. But if we will have obedience, if we will listen to his word, if we will know who he is and what he says, and we will take that bold step to say, even when I don't feel like it, I am going to follow you, we will find that blessing will come, and blessings that are unimaginable, blessings that are very hard for us to fathom, blessings that we could never see with our own eyes or achieve within our own power. As you go into your discussion time with your leaders and you start to dig into these questions about identifying the loudest voices and any areas you might have a hard time listening to God or hearing his voice, even those times where you might have heard it pretty clearly and you chose not to follow in obedience, I want you to remember that you are so loved and that we've all been there. And if you're a mom, you can look at your own kids and remember those moments where you have had to encourage them and teach them that obedience is key to successful and healthy living, that we have to learn to follow those things, those convictions that we have, those words that we write on our heart when we adopt Scripture and we soak it into the very core of who we are. That we're not always going to feel like it, and it's not always going to be easy to understand up front. God will even call you to do things that you can't possibly imagine how he's going to make it work, but he always does. When we are in obedience with God, when we walk in alignment with his heart and his plan for our lives, there is literally no limit to the blessing he can give us. None. 5 lessons in. You're 5 lessons in, and you have 3 more to go. So my challenge to you, my encouragement to you is to be obedient. Listen to his voice. By now, if you're spending time with him, I promise you, you're hearing it. And I promise you that you probably recognize it more than you want to give yourself credit for. The challenge we often have is that it may be asking us to do something or even to stop doing something as an act of our obedience to him. We forget sometimes that as beautiful and loving and graceful and merciful as God is, that he is still a holy God who has a holy set-apart plan for your life and mine. We love you, ladies, so much, and we are praying for you and are going to continue to pray for you. So as you go into this discussion time, I encourage you just to take some time and to really be vulnerable, if not with your group, at least with yourself and God. Take the time to go home and answer these questions if you've not already done it. Really dig deep. I promise you will not regret it. We'll see you next time. We love you. We're praying for you. And we are so, so glad to be on this journey with you. Take care now.